Hey folks, this is Travis Arnold, and I'm doing my TED Talk on an experience that I had as a student teacher. So, to set the scene, it was a Friday. It was almost 30 minutes before the start of school, and my university supervisor, Mrs. Bennett, walked into the room unexpectedly, and I was kind of taken aback because she wasn't scheduled to come in. The urgency of the look on her face told me that immediately something was terribly wrong. Get all your things. You're leaving. Get everything that's here, that's yours. Take it with you because you're not coming back, is what she told me. I just stood there frozen for several moments trying to make my mind comprehend what she'd said. And I was like a deer in headlights. What was all I could really muster in return. She said, "You're done teaching here. You can never come back. You'll never have any contact with anyone at the school. And so quickly gather your things, let's go." So now my mind's reeling. I could never come back. No contact with anyone here. What was that supposed to look like? I mean, I was going to be applying for jobs in a few months, and now I couldn't use my student teaching as a reference. Had someone at school accused me of something? Had I just failed student teaching? I mean, I couldn't fail. I'd never failed before when it came to school. I couldn't afford to fail. I mean, literally couldn't afford it. The semester at DePaul was 15 grand. My parents were pretty clear about the whole for and done thing. So if it was going to be any longer than that, it was going to be on me, and I didn't have any money. So I stood there, and another what escaped my drooping jaws. I continued to stand there frozen. "Let's go," she said, this time with more urgency. "You need to get your things now. Come with me. She told me to get in your car and follow. She told me to follow her to her office, and we would talk about what's going to happen next." So the urgency in her voice brought me back to the immediate situation. So I started looking around and haphazardly throwing things into a crate I'd use to transport my teaching stuff back and forth from the dorm room to school. I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach, something like nausea and despair. Um, it's not quite as bad as like a friend died, but maybe your favorite character on The Walking Dead just died. I wanted to cry a little bit, but I thought men don't cry, so just keep it together. I quickly gathered the little in the classroom that was mine and turned to Mrs. Bennett and asked, "What about student work?" "Leave it," she said, like a condescending parent would tell a child that's looking at like a leaf on the ground or something. So I shuffled through my crate and placed some ungraded papers, because they were always ungraded, uh, on Mrs. Steuerwald's desk and looked at Mrs. Bennett, wondering whether she knew she held my entire future in her hands, as she told me, all these things and gave me all these commands. "Is that everything?" she said. I said, "Yeah." And she looked at me and said, "This is for the best." Finally addressing the elephant in the room of, what exactly was going on, and, how I would handle this going forward. And we traveled down a long hallway where it seemed like everyone had stopped to stare at me as I was kind of paraded down the hall, giving me weird looks as I went out the front door of South Putnam Junior Senior High School. In the following hours, I'd learned from our conversation the past week, Tanya Bennett had seen my enthusiasm and confidence and positive attitude wane till I was just really a small, just complete shell of my former self. And I had really kind of become depressed, and my my attitude was just getting worse and worse, to where she was actually said she was concerned with my mental health. And she decided that it was better for me that I discontinue teaching with Mrs. Sturwald. Um, and she had said she realized that South Putnam wasn't a good fit for me a long time ago, and she hoped that I would pull through and I would bring some like youth and enthusiasm to the school rather than them bringing me down. And so she'd work behind the scenes to find me another placement teaching at nearby middle school called Greencastle Middle School under Mr. Troy Greenlee. She said I'd not yet failed student teaching despite earning a C at midterm and now being placed at a new school. And it would basically, Mr. Greenlee's recommendation would hedge on, the fact that would I get my student teaching, or would I get my full teaching certificate in the coming months, or whether I would actually have to repeat student teaching. Inside, I was actually secretly giddy with delight to be out from under the reign of the Ice Queen, Mrs. Sturwald. Although I didn't really show it because I didn't know how I was supposed to react. You see, Sturwald had told me about 2 weeks into my sentence with her that there's one way students learn, and it's lecture, and that she suggests that I stop doing what I was doing and having kids going all over the room doing God knows what and working in groups because they weren't actually getting anything done, and that I just keep lecturing every day. And I chose not to heed her advice, and our relationship grew pretty cold and stony over the next coming week. So I wasn't an amazing student teacher by any stretch, but I was pretty sure that what Mrs. Sturwald was telling me was not accurate. And I really intended to show her otherwise, that what I was doing could be better than lecture every day. However, as time went on, she stayed in our classroom less and less. And I don't think it was because that her confidence in me had grown at all. It was that I think that she really couldn't stomach my newfangled methods, and her many warnings continued to fall on deaf ears. So I don't blame her, nor do I question why she thought of my teaching in such ways. I mean, she grew up in an era that hadn't prepared her for the students that she faced now. She was toward the end of her teaching career, and the way she had learned and the way she had been taught to teach others was different. And she had taught the way she'd always taught, the same way she did 30 years ago, which I'm sure of this because she didn't mind telling me that 50 or 60 times a day. And the impression that I got from Mrs. Sturwald is that her idea of successful student teaching would be turning in my lesson plans on time each week, which basically was a list of all the things that I would lecture on for that week. And I never got my lesson plans in on time, which was a main cause of our conflict, mainly because I actually spent many hours planning what I would do with students rather than just telling them everything I knew in a long list of lecture. I can remember spending nearly all day one weekend writing this skit that students would act out as a kind of reenactment of all the major players in World War One. And first period I tried it and it went great. And so Sturwald had actually heard a student talking about it in the hallway, and so she came in the next class to watch it. Second period went about as well, and there were some complete hams who took a little bit too far, especially when Franz Ferdinand got killed. And so after that period, Sturwald pulled the plug on me and forbade me from continuing the skit for the rest of the day. And that was just one example of how she stifled my creativity and teaching pedagogy throughout that semester. But again, I don't blame Mrs. Stierwald for the horrible time I had with her because she'd not been equipped with the skills she needed to face an ever-changing world, where students maybe didn't learn the same that she did. And how many of us can relate to that? How many boring teachers do we have that stood up and lectured for an hour and you're just required to take notes and keep up and you regurgitate the information for the test and then move on to do the same thing with the next unit? And the happy ending in this particular story is that I had a great experience teaching with Mr. Grinley, and my confidence in teaching was restored. While I'm sure lots of student teachers choose not to teach for a good reason, this had been my career path since I was a junior in high school. But my experience is not the moral of the story. Mrs. Stierwald's experience is. And you might be sitting there thinking, Mr. Arnold, we can't really learn anything from Mrs. Stierwald. We're not like her. We don't use lecture every day. And you use fill in the blank, whether it be workshop model or some other best practice. But what are you preparing your students for? Are you preparing your students for the world that you grew up in? Or for the ones that they are growing up in now? Or are you preparing them for the world of tomorrow? Are you preparing them to think critically? Are you preparing them to solve tomorrow's problems and to adjust to new types of real world situations and difficulties no matter what they're going to face? And if we can't say yes to those questions, then we're just like Mrs. Stierwald. And we're creating more and more Stierwalds every day. Students who do things the same way that they had been taught and the same way they had done them when they were kids. And there's a saying that if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. And so, what have you always got? And some of us are stuck in the mindset of, well, I taught it, they just didn't learn it. Well, have you ever thought about changing the way you taught it so students actually learn it? And we don't live in the days of stand and deliver, sage on the stage. We live in the days of 30-minute delivery, of Amazon Prime, 2-day shipping, of grocery delivery to your door, that, the age of now. And, the average attention span of a middle school child is 10 to 12 minutes. And that's an average. So that means some kids are tuning you out after 3 or 4 minutes. And how are we going to teach those kids? You got to get them up. You got to get them moving. You got to get them doing things that they care about, solving problems that they want to solve, and get them engaged in an activity that they feel a part of. And so my challenge is to really examine your practices and think intentionally about, what are you preparing students for? Are you preparing them for something that they need to remember for 40 minutes, for something they need to remember for 40 days, or something that they need to remember for 40 years? We have to remember that our students will have to solve problems and, move into jobs that don't even exist yet. Are you preparing them for that?